Hello and welcome to the Wish You Knew podcast. I'm your host, Karen Bortvet. Today, for our first full episode, we have a very special guest. Her name is Alex, and if you checked out her bio on the website, you will see that she identifies as deaf, though that's only one of her many identities and her many skill sets. One of them seems to be languages. She mentions that she has learned 11 different languages in her lifetime. I tell you, I am someone who learns languages fairly easily, but that number is impressive. There are not a lot of people out there that have learned 11 different languages. Many of you may be wondering, why would you start an audio podcast with someone who is deaf? Well, this week is the International Week of the Deaf. That's a week that takes place once a year, and the focus is for the deaf community to celebrate being deaf. Throughout the year, as a person who is deaf, I have been told you're always surrounded a lot of times by the hearing community, and for that 1 week, you just get to celebrate being deaf. There's different activities that go on around the world. Different associations of the deaf will put on events. At those events, it's about raising deaf awareness and also just providing fun activities for the deaf community. When I lived in Cambodia and worked in the deaf community, that was one of our busiest weeks each year because we tried to have events every day as well as a huge party on the weekend, so our deaf community could just come together and celebrate and be in a space that was a completely deaf environment or deaf-friendly environment where everyone was signing. So for that reason, I wanted this week to focus on somebody who identifies as deaf. So now let's start talking with Alex. Welcome, Alex. Thanks so much for being willing to come on the podcast. You'd said you were an introvert, so I'm sure it's even more difficult to do something like this as an introvert. Your bio is very impressive. I know we have a bunch of listeners who are fascinated by how you have done so many amazing things as a deaf person. For many of us hearing folks, the thought of losing our hearing is terrifying, when really it's just a different approach to life. We are very, very glad to have you here to enlighten us. First, you mentioned you have studied and used 11 different languages. Whoa! Which is more difficult for you, learning a new sign language or written language?
First, I want to clarify that I am not claiming fluency in all of those. I have forgotten the sign language I used in Vietnam almost entirely, as I was there less than a year, quite some time ago, and have not used it since. But while I was there, I was totally immersed in it. The rest I continue to use on occasion at various levels. A couple, like French, I understand or read well, but have very limited expressive command. As for which is more difficult, learning a sign or spoken language, it depends. In general, I pick up sign languages more quickly as they seem to have more in common with each other due to their visual nature than spoken languages have in common with each other. If you know one sign language, it is easier to learn others than someone who has never learned any sign language. But, as I have a good command of Spanish, I learned Italian fairly quickly, as they are both Romance languages and have a lot in common. Were I to tackle, say, Japanese, it would be a whole different story.
You mentioned various sign language. Is there one universal sign language? I know a lot of people have asked me that in the past.
No, there isn't. It actually puzzles me why people would think there would be. How in the world could a single language emerge from hundreds of countries and communities that have no contact with each other? If there is not one universal spoken language, why would there be a universal signed language? Anyway, more or less each country has its own sign language. Some countries have more than one, and some sign languages are used in more than one country. There is something called International Sign, but it is not called International Sign Language for a reason. It's not classified as a language, but as a kind of pidgin. It doesn't have the regular rules that a full language has, and there are no native speakers. Yes, it's possible to say that someone speaks a sign language. It's not used as a home language by anyone. International Sign, abbreviated as IS, developed among deaf people who traveled, attended international conferences and sporting events, and otherwise have repeated interaction with other deaf people from different countries, and is used in those contexts. What we call International Sign is largely influenced by European Sign Languages and ASL, American Sign Language. There's a common core vocabulary of sorts, but it is quite fluid and changeable depending on individuals who are using it. So a presentation given on stage in IS will likely be different from the IS used in a conversation between two Europeans, and again different from that used between, say, someone from the US and someone from Cambodia.
Are there accents in different sign languages?
Yes, there are. I can't explain it, though. I can say that I can somehow always spot a native Greek, for example, even when they're signing ASL. There's been very little linguistic research on accents in signed languages, and most of that has been on L2 learner accents, second language learners or non-native signers. Accent means how someone produces or pronounces things, not which word or signs they use. Like whether you would say tomato or tomato, not whether you would say soda or pop. Sign languages have the same thing. That is, people will produce signs differently in ways that give them away as non-native signers or from a particular region. But sometimes when people say accents, they mean dialect or variation. So I'll touch on that too. As in spoken languages, there's a lexical variation within sign languages, like how in U.S. languages some people call a long sandwich a hoagie, poor boy, sub, and other terms. There are different signs for the same concept within sign languages too. In BSL, British Sign Language, 17 different signs for the color purple have been identified.
17 different ways to say the color purple. Whoa! It is my favorite color, though, so I support that. So you have studied all of these different languages. Can you lip read different languages?
I can, to an extent. Not very well in any of them. I avoid it as much as possible. Most of my life is spent around other signing people, whether at work, home, or socially. So I'm not confronted with it that often, actually. Months may go by without me using my voice at all. Many deaf people won't or don't speak or attempt to lip read. For others, it's their primary means of face-to-face communication. So, technically, Spanish is easier to lip read than English, as more of the sounds are frontal and visible. Only about a third of English is visible on the lips. I don't know the percentage for Spanish, but it's higher. Italian is similar. In fact, when I first arrived in Italy, it looked like people were speaking Spanish to me. Anyway, lip reading is really a misnomer. It's not at all like reading. It's not just lips. Reading print is literally in black and white. No guesswork involved unless the handwriting is really bad. Trying to understand what someone is saying just by watching them speak is mostly guesswork. You take that 30% or whatever that you can actually see and try to piece the rest together using your knowledge of the language, context, and other cues from facial expressions and gestures. Add that much of what is visible looks very similar, like pat, bat, and mat. You get a sort of mental gymnastics that is absolutely exhausting and is never perfect. They should call it speech guessing instead of speech reading. Also, some people are just easier to understand than others. I have to say that I hate it when somebody asks, "Do you read lips?" It's really a trick question. Everyone, including all you listeners, can read lips to an extent. In fact, you all probably do it as well or better than I can, as you have spent your entire lives speaking and listening to English, a great advantage for lip reading over someone who has never heard at all. You just rarely have the need to, except in very noisy settings, or talking through a window, or telling a secret or something. So if you ask me if I want tea or coffee, sure, I'll probably be able to lip read that, especially if you're standing there with a kettle in your hand. Context is key. If you want to have a heart-to-heart chat about our hopes and dreams or about Kantian philosophy, then all bets are off. It's just too exhausting, frustrating on both our parts. And why in the world would you want me to guess what your hopes and dreams are anyway? Life is short. I'm really interested in what you have to say and want to spend my energy connecting with you, not guessing at what you say and trying to just nod and act like I understand. Writing things down may take longer, but I'll make a connection that way, and we can talk about real stuff. In the past, when the umpteenth person has asked me the dreaded question, I may or may not have been tempted beyond my power to resist to answer, "You want to read lips? Okay, I will if you will," and proceed to talk to them orally with no voice. They inevitably panic and say something like, "Oh no, not me, just you." Then I tell them that hardly seems fair, and ask them why they don't want to lip read an entire conversation. "It's too hard," they say. Yep. Now, some deaf and hard of hearing people are proficient at lip reading, speech guessing, and don't mind doing it, and may not even sign at all. For them, it's just how they talk with people. Most of them use their residual hearing with amplification, hearing aids, or cochlear implants, in addition to watching the face. They put what they see and what they hear together. Remember that deaf people can hear sounds to varying degrees. It's not all or nothing. Hearing devices aren't useful for everyone. Most proficient speech readers that I know struggle much more if they are not using their hearing device. So the audio information is pretty important for them. And there are a few who do remarkably well with just the visual information alone. Good for them. They're a rarity. Not everyone can be Sue Thomas, FBI. So what can you say instead of, "Do you read lips?" I suppose I'd really like it if hearing people would ask me, "How shall we communicate?" Because that's what you really want to know. You want to know if you should speak to me, or write, or use gestures, or the manual alphabet that you've learned back in scouting, or what. The solution might actually be a combination of all of that, depending on the person, the situation, and the topic at hand. I really like it if hearing people took more responsibility for our communication instead of expecting deaf people to accommodate them by reading lips, which involves little or no extra effort on the hearing person's part. "Oh, I'll take tea, please. Milk, no sugar."
In my mind, this topic of language ties in with culture, as language is a huge part of culture.